So welcome to our webinar series organized by our IPSA RC07 committee, Women and Politics in the Global South, under the umbrella of the International Political Association, Political Science Association. This is our first ever webinar that we held under the committee. So before I start, let me just tell you a little bit about RC7. So RC7 Research Committee originated in an interest, gender and development, and squarely addresses the persistent issues, challenges, and questions relating to the presence and experience of women in the, in the political sphere, their participation, institutional and other barriers, women and the environment, women and democratization, women's leadership in economic institutions, and women's human rights. So these webinars that are organized are the perfect place to tackle these issues. Our webinars take place every third Wednesday of the month and are open to any researchers in the field of gender development, women in politics, women, peace and security, gender and law and human rights. So we welcome and encourage you to submit your pitches, to have the opportunity to present your research in these informative and insightful webinars. Here, if you see on the screen, we have the announcement on how you can register and send us your pitches. So today we are very happy and delighted to welcome or have Dr. Niharika Pandit from Queen Mary University of London, who will present on Rethinking Militarisation as Co-constituting Coloniality and their military occupation. Dr. Niharika is a feminist theorist interested in questions of gender, racialization, post-coloniality, everyday politics, of living and epistemic and political potentialities of theorizing from the Global South. Insistently interdisciplinary, her research, writing, and teaching draw on transnational, anti-colonial, and liberatory feminist and queer thinking. Before joining the SPIR, she was a postdoctoral fellow at the Department of Gender Studies, London School of Economics and Political Science, where she received her PhD in September 2022. Wow, what a quiet biography. Congratulations, Dr. Niharika. She is also an editorial collective member of Engendering and Otherwise magazine. She is also fellow of the Higher Education Academy. So, Dr. Niharika, the floor is yours, and we really look forward to hearing from you and to learn from you. This is such an interesting topic. After your talk, we're gonna be 20 minutes presentation, and after we're going to open the floor to our participants for comments and discussions. Dr. Niharika, the floor is yours. I think we should unmute Dr. Niharika. You still unmuted?
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Okay, amazing. Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning, depending on where you're joining from. I'd like to begin by thanking the Women in Politics in the Global South group for organizing this webinar. And also thanks so much, Yasmin, for that introduction. So my talk today is based on my ethnographic and theoretical work that is part of my forthcoming book, titled On the Politics of Living, Gendered Struggles Under Coloniality and Occupation in Kashmir. So while this research examines the everyday politics of living in Kashmir under Indian state's control, that is how Kashmiri Muslim subjects experience conditions of militarized control and violence in their everyday lives, and also their responses and contestations to it. My talk today will focus on rethinking militarization beyond its dominant understandings as a benign or even subtle process, and I do this from an anti-colonial feminist standpoint. So in these years of my research engagement with Kashmir, Many people that I've been speaking with describe the conditions they survive under as military occupation, and occupation as a form of enforced militarization by the Indian state. As a feminist researcher who's interested in grounded frameworks, archives, and methods, and committed to understanding the imaginaries and practices of world making that marginalized peoples articulate, this required that I interrogate the conceptual roots opened up when we consider occupation as an analytic of feminist inquiry. So it was imperative to begin by conceptualizing occupation, how it is sustained by militarization, and how thinking with the empirical condition of Kashmir may orient us towards a different understanding of militarization itself. So Kashmiri scholar Nitasha Kaul identifies 5th of August 2019, when the Indian state forcibly removed Kashmir's nominal autonomy and accelerated settler politics in the region, as the moment when, in her own words, even the pretense of autonomy and recognition was given up, and all phenomena constituting coloniality became conspicuous and acute. So this post-2019 ethnographic archive that my book assembles makes evident that occupation of Kashmir is not just another type or form of militarization, as has been theorized by scholars situated or working in global North contexts. Occupation is also not captured by existing thinking on militarism, militarization, concepts that gained currency during the Cold War context, but rather to understand occupation, its gendered and racialized logics, its settler politics, violent military practices and effects. It is important to look at occupation as shaped by and co-producing the coloniality of the Indian state. So while emerging from British and European colonial logics, such as racialized othering of Muslims and legal emergency frameworks that I'll talk more about, I argue that occupation and the militarizing processes that sustain it can sit very well and even flourish through mechanisms of coloniality that have shaped modern nation states. So while critical and feminist studies on militarization, largely from the global north, conceive militarization as an everyday process that uses and widens gendered, racialized, and other social hierarchies, this understanding is insufficient to explain the conditions of saturated state control, surveillance, and violence in Kashmir. Not least because existing theorizations of militarization remain attached to the liberal democratic nature of the state. So treating geographies of violence as exceptional or anomalous to the state that is otherwise presumed to be a liberal guarantor of rights and freedom. And a key example of this, as Kashmiri scholars like Athar Zia and Mona Bhan have pointed out, is the Indian state orienting itself as the world's largest democracy, yet justifying its actions in Kashmir as necessary to maintain its integrity. These conventional theorizations then also do not account for what Goldie Ossory has called post-colonial imperialism or emergent decolonial thinking, which understands contemporary nation states as colonial entities in their own right. So I'm building on and adding to this growing body of anti-colonial literature that has begun to untether militarization from liberal theorizing. There have been recent calls by feminist and critical scholars to do away with the concept of militarization altogether. Many of them, quite correctly, argue that militarization suggests a clean break or shift in global as well as everyday politics. So in simple words, militarization as a term suggests that something, someone that was not militarized before has now been roped into war ideology, or that increased militarization on a global scale has largely been an effect of the Cold War. What dominant formulations of militarization, and this includes even some feminist analyses that continue to see militarization as subtle. And here we may ask, for whom is militarization subtle? So these formulations tend to remove the histories of ongoing continuities of racism colonialism and carceral politics that has long subjugated marginalized groups through militaristic and warlike control. In not rejecting the concept altogether, especially as I think with Kashmir as both an empirical and an epistemological site, where overwhelming control and violence is driven by military forces who occupy vast amounts of land and operate with impunity, I propose that we think of militarization as a logic and aspect of contemporary coloniality. So by thinking with Kashmir, I argue that enforced militarization of the region by the Indian state, and this is effected through dense armed presence, spatial occupation, everyday violence and humiliation, suppression of dissent and resistance, is not exceptional to a liberal democratic state, but part of its own colonial politics and rule in the region. So thinking of militarization as an aspect of coloniality challenges easy assumptions about colonialism to show how post-colonial states too reproduce and invent violent colonial dynamics. And this requires that we pass the colonial structures that militarization remains implicated in. Occupation of Kashmir orients us towards processes of militarization that are constitutively violent and disciplinary. And this can be seen in how regular checks and surveillance, interrogation, or the overbearing military presence in public spaces creates a perpetual sense of fear and control and often causes fatal violence. So I'm thinking with my interviewees' everyday experiences of living, alongside interrogating dominant Indian state narratives to show how militarization is enforced to further colonial control on people who challenge state sovereignty. And this increased militarized control is often justified through narratives of national security. So coloniality of power, and to think of this concept as conceptualized by Latin American decolonial scholars, brings to light the persistence of colonial order and relations in the modern colonial world systems, even after formal colonial rules may have ended. Anibal Quijano notes how racial classification was a fundamental rationality of European colonialism, by which diverse people were classified, and I quote here, into ranks, places, roles in the new society's structure of power. This is not to say that pre-colonial societies did not have any regulations. For example, maintenance of caste hierarchies through endogamy in India predate European colonialism. And claims of a pure pre-colonial past, especially in the context that the subcontinental context I'm working in, is quite risky. So rather focusing on how colonialism established regulatory mechanisms through penal codes, emergency laws, knowledge productions for gender, race, and sexuality, bring to light how a lot of these regulations remain at play and continue to characterize post-colonial state politics. So coloniality of power in this way is also alerting us to the limitation of formal decolonization processes that were often heralded by bourgeois nationalistic figures in appending gender, religious, caste, and ethnic hierarchies, especially as formal governance power often largely shifted to local elites. And coloniality then for Enlovo Gatcheno becomes present today as the invisible power structure that sustains colonial relations of exploitation and domination long after the end of direct colonialism. Now in Kashmir, thinking through coloniality helps grasp the logic and discourses of gender and racialization that bolster Indian nationalism and sovereignty, and undergird occupation with distinct gendered and racialized vulnerabilities in everyday life. Racialization can be understood in how coded representations of othering in racial and cultural terms by powerful social groups and institutions structure social and political relations. And an intersectional approach to racialization maps racialized discourses in their articulations with gender, nation, religion, ethnicity, as well as the colonial continuities. In Indian nationalist narratives then, Kashmiri Muslims are varyingly racialized across the axes of suspect, miscreant, terrorist, naive, while the region is seen as a feminized territory, whose integration becomes crucial for it exemplifies India's secular roots in contrast to Muslim Pakistan. For the BJP-led regime, controlling Kashmir is essential for the flourishing of Hindutva, to which designating Hindus as not Muslims and not Muslims as original inhabitants of Kashmir is crucial, while any resistance to this reductive framing of the region as simply a Hindu-Muslim issue is charged as anti-national and seditious. While the exponential rise of Hindutva has racialized all Indian Muslims as an enemy within, with majoritarian violence unleashed on their bodies, what sets Jammu and Kashmir, its majority Muslim Kashmir region, and all of its inhabitants apart is also their multiple marginality, the region's historic movement for self-determination, and contiguity with Pakistan. And therefore, Kashmiri Muslims are always already racialized as suspects and threat to the security of the nation state, and their movement for self-determination only characterized as cross-border propaganda or terrorism. Now, gender significantly complicates these discourses and their socio-material effects in how feminized Kashmir becomes available for capture and ought to be saved by the paternalistic Indian state. The territory of Kashmir is framed as inviting Indian state and public intervention for saving Kashmir, and by extension, Kashmiri women from suspect Kashmiri men. The stickiness of these discourses in Indian imagination creates a germane ground for using military force as a logical means to control the region in the guise of retaining sovereignty, where the nation's citizenry is mobilized to support a militarized, masculinist, and belligerent occupation. Now, these discourses also latch on to Islamophobia and have found resonance with global anti-Muslim politics in post 9/11 world, together with the rise of Hindutva. Thinking through coloniality remains pertinent to understanding the logics and discourses of gender, racialization, nation, sovereignty that undergird occupation. If modern nation state is a colonial remnant, attention to coloniality allows me to follow the governing logics that make the occupation of Kashmir a possibility in the first place. And this becomes clear in how the integration of Muslim majority Kashmir in the Indian Union was crucial precisely as it embodies the latter's secular roots. Attention to coloniality also problematizes linear temporality in international relations thinking that suggest how excessive militarism in India was a result only of post-colonial anxieties since the end of the Cold War. Certainly, the scale of military presence and control increased tremendously after the 1989 armed revolt. But thinking of coloniality and occupation as linked shows how the state politics in Kashmir was always structured by a military integrationist approach, a colonizing approach, as Suvir Kaul calls it, from 1947, when India gained political independence. And on this, Hafsa Kanjwal's recent book, Colonizing Kashmir, is a stellar historical account for anyone interested in thinking through integration and developmentalism as a colonial policy. So while so far I've parsed the logics of gender and racialization that undergird coloniality and I've shown how militarization is used to enforce colonial control, I now want to focus on an ethnographic vignette to emphasize these arguments a little more. I'm going to quickly share my screen so you all have the time to see the quote. I hope you can, I'll just give you a couple of seconds to read through this. Sidra's father, a medical doctor, died in his early 30s, making her mother the sole earner of their family, with 3 children and minimal familial support. Growing up in 1990s, Sidra recalled how soldiers stationed in a military camp in their rural North Kashmir neighborhood would often come to meet her father for medical advice. As a doctor, he considered it his duty to support every patient, whether they were protesters, civilians, or soldiers. As a child, Sidra did not fully comprehend the everyday vulnerabilities of living despite the volatile political conditions. A senior army official, she said, became good friends with her father and visit every now and then for chai. In narrating her experience, Sidra realized that perhaps the army personnel visited their house so often because they wanted to keep a check on their father, who they thought was also offering medical assistance to militants. Upon her father's death, however, this seemingly friendly dynamic changed quickly. Her mother, then a housewife with no stable income or social support, had to take on care and earning responsibilities. Even as her widowed status made Sidra's mother hypervisible, with increased social scrutiny on her behavior, appearance, and who she was visiting, soldiers did not stop coming to their house. Sidra, by then a teenager, found these visits deeply uncomfortable. The personnel said that they'd received information that Sidra's father had also offered medical treatment to militants. After several such visits, now more intrusive with frequent questioning, her mother said that she had no information about who his patients were, but none of the militants that soldier claimed he had treated ever came home. In speaking about the relentless search and questioning, Sidra remembered how soldiers' boot marks would soil carpets of their home. This required material and affective labor, as both Sidra and her mother had to rearrange vandalized items, clean muddied carpets for it to only happen again. Eventually, with her mother, Sidra went to the army camp around their area and made several requests to the commanding officer to stop harassing their family. Their visceral fear, magnified by gendered vulnerability, is palpable. As a single parent, Sidra's mother becomes hypervisible, making her family and their home easy targets of militarized control, wherein her personal circumstances open her up both to social and state scrutiny. While these regular visits have stopped, gunfights continue to take place in Sidra's village. In these difficult circumstances, Sidra is fearful that her brothers, one of whom lives with a developmental condition, may be used as a human shield. Sidra's fears are not unfounded. She told me of a cordon and search operation in 2020, during which her brother was used as a shield as security personnel searched their home and neighboring residences for possible militants. Had there been a gunfight, his death, Sidra said, would callously be marked as collateral damage. How a military colonial occupation produces and deploys gendered and racialized hierarchies is clear in Sidra's account. Dominant Indian narratives that variously frame Kashmiri Muslims as deviant, suspect, untrustworthy, radicalized, or naive, who need saving, dehumanize and objectify Kashmiri subjects as collaterals and shields who become susceptible to killing for the state to hold on to Kashmir as its integral part. This gender-race nexus is essential for occupation to sustain through militarized control and coercion, which further widens gendered and racialized forms of bodily, material, psychic, and existential vulnerabilities. So when dominant scholarly accounts simply analyze the everydayness of militarization without mapping how routine life is also structured by systemic hierarchies that unfold violence, there's a risk of depoliticizing the everyday, which becomes devoid of structural power and contestation. Contrastingly, in Kashmir, it is the everydayness of occupation that exacerbates mortal fear and uncertainty. Sidra, who's a social scientist, also recalled how some of her female interlocutors shared their experiences of being socially ostracized and shunned for their bad character after they were harassed by security personnel. In one such incident, after her harassment case came to light, neighbors had protested in support of her interlocutor Saima, but were fired upon, causing a death. Following this incident, neighbors started blaming Saima, who was forced to discontinue her education and leave the village to stay elsewhere for months. Sidra mentioned this to emphasize the different forms of gendered vulnerability and control which is exacerbated under occupation, and how it also does not lead to easy solidarities among people, but increased social scrutiny, restriction, and even alienation for some women. So feminist attention to the coloniality of militarization helps trace these complex gender dynamics to make visible the shared gendered codes between militaristic and social patriarchies. Rather than blurring the civilian-military divide, as is theorized in non-conflict contexts, under occupation, racialized framing of Kashmiri Muslims and their consequent dehumanization do not distinguish combatants from non-combatants, while simultaneously widening the divide between civilians and the military. An overarching sense of insecurity is instituted through emergency laws like the Armed Forces Special Powers Act, which is a British colonial framework that grants the armed forces the power to fire upon or otherwise use, even to the causing of death, arrest without warrant any person who's committed a cognizable offense or against whom a reasonable suspicion exists, while creating regimes of impunity, as soldiers are seldom brought to trial for rights violation. AFSPA cements a hierarchy of power and rights between civilians and the military, especially as the reasonable suspicion clause does not distinguish who's a combatant and who's a non-combatant. Further, laws like the Public Safety Act and the Unlawful Activities Prevention Act extend control, militaristic control to civilian institutions like the police. These military, legal, political machinations constitute India's coloniality in Kashmir, where, in the words of Sumi Madhok, the policies and practices of the Indian state that enable it to extend formations of colonial power, such as the imposition of the Armed Forces Special Powers Act, institutionalize a differential distribution of citizenship characterized by judicial and political abandonment. Thus, dominant accounts that do not examine the lethal violence and control perpetuated by states and do not pay sufficient attention to colonial governance are at the risk of discounting its insidious nature. So, to conclude, supplementing coloniality with militarization in the context of Kashmir does important analytical work. So first, it allows us to conceive militarization as Amina Mama and Okazawa write, a gendered regime characterized by discourses and practices that subordinate and oppress women, and as well as non-dominant men, reinforcing hierarchies of class, gender, race, and ethnicity, and in some contexts, caste, religion, and location. It also frames militarization as a socio-spatial process that suffuses everyday life with embodied, affective, and material uncertainties, as the account that I elaborated shows. And militarization, when conceived this way, shows that everyday uncertainties are always co-constituted by and not removed from the colonial logics and processes that take place under occupation. In this way, the state-enforced militarization that we see in Kashmir deploys technologies of colonial control, violence, coercion, and discipline, and is regulated through the hierarchies of gender and racialization that come to have distinct effects. Despite recent calls to disavow militarization, why I retain the concept, although cautiously and critically, is because of its potential to account for the overwhelming military power and control in Kashmir. It also helps historicize the 1989 struggle, post which the Indian state instituted a more militarized process by designating the region as disturbed and by enforcing a set of emergency laws. So accounting for militarization with coloniality also destabilizes linear temporalities of pre and post-colonialism, instead frames militarization and occupation as aspects that characterize the settler colonial present. With this conceptualization, we can begin to map the everyday infusion of occupation, a colonial military state project that uses and increases social hierarchies and is both ubiquitous and extraordinary, precisely as there's nothing routine about the brazenness of militarized control. And I'll stop here. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to your questions and comments.
Thank you so much, Dr. Niharika, for this very valuable, interesting, insightful presentation, where you actually delve into an empirical attention to the global South geographies, but also, their epistemic, potentialities in what we understand of militarization and how critical and feminist knowledge that is, oriented towards justice, which can be produced. So without further ado, I would like to open the floor to our participants for any comments and questions. Maybe we have a question here on the messages. So I'm going to read it. It's from ED. It's Eloisa de Castro. Thank you so much for attending, Eloisa. So what would be the first step towards resolution in your opinion?
Thank you, Eloisa. My research is more, I think it's less solutionist in the way it approaches, also because there are a lot of Kashmiri scholars who live and work in the region who have who variously articulated what kind of approaches could be, or what kind of resolutions could be articulated to resolve the conflict and do away with occupation. But I think at the level, and this I speak as an Indian citizen, right? At the level of the state is firstly the recognition that there is this form of occupational violence and the form of colonial control that is being unfolded every day. So I think, and this is quite central to how even a lot of feminist work is oriented, which starts from a recognition of the wrongdoing or the recognition of historical and ongoing injustice that's been inflicted in the name of consolidating the boundaries of the nation state. So I think I can speak from that standpoint, but within the wide and vibrant range of critical Kashmir studies, there are different ways in which scholars have articulated what self-determination also means and how any visible exercise towards self-determination should ascertain that people who are directly affected by conditions of control or who have struggled historically and still struggle for their own right to self-determination are made or are occupying center stage in any kind of resolution. So I hope that has begun to respond to what you were asking.
This is coming from Dr. Swarna. I think I understood that you had done field work for this project. I was curious about how challenging that was and how you went about it.
Thanks, Swarna, for the question. So my engagement with Kashmir so it began when I was working as a journalist right after my undergraduate in Delhi. And there were lots of discussions that were going on in terms of doing collective study around Kashmir at that point of time. And so when I went for my field work, and this was in 2020, we're at the height of the pandemic, I'd already there were already sustained connections and sustained conversations that were ongoing, especially during the time of August 2019, when there was a deoperationalization of Article 370. So there were lots of challenges to navigate, especially to make sure that people I'm speaking with are not under any sort of, they do not get any form of retaliation from the state, right? So I think it's quite risky when you're also working in zones of deep sort of control and surveillance, that our research participants are not at the receiving end of any kind of that kind of backlash. So I think I started from my own networks and from my own professional as well as journalistic associations. And I made sure that I was speaking with people who were also really aware or who knew what the possible backlash could be, right? So it was speaking with people who were engaged in, they weren't in any political sort of space, but still doing deeply political work in relation to research, in relation to journalism, in relation to being artists or students. So I think that kind of ethical and that kind of commitment to ensuring confidentiality and to ensuring that nobody gets any form of backlash was really important. And then the nature of my work, because it was more exploratory, and as I said briefly at the starting of my presentation, that I wasn't approaching through a specific lens. So occupation as a concept is also something that emerged in my fieldwork. And this is some of the articulations that a lot of my interviewees made to make sense of their condition. So the moment of our encounter in the multiple interview spaces was also quite open-ended and was also quite exploratory, in which I wanted to understand what becomes of everyday life, or I wanted to navigate with them what happens in everyday life. So I think there was a lot of these elements brought up together that made for a very exploratory, very ethnographically oriented work. And challenges, I think there are lots of challenges in relation to surveillance, right? And when you're working on contested topics, there's always already that sense of surveillance that's going on. But what's really surprising is, and quite disheartening in many ways, is that the moment you talk about the fact that you're doing gender research, you're not seen as someone who's doing extremely political work, which sometimes in fieldwork scenarios can really be useful for you, because it just puts you out of any kind of limelight. But at the same time, the fact that people still don't consider gender or feminist research as explicitly political is something I think all of us collectively, within and outside of academia, need to contest and question, right? So I hope that reflects on some of the challenges that I faced, and these are ongoing challenges that also are persisting throughout, right?
You know, how can gender help in this conflict? How can women help in this and can we have a conflict transformation instead of a conflict resolution? Because a conflict can last forever. So you have conflicts that have been lasting for so many years, and there is no way out. So can we transform this conflict into an opportunity?
I think that's a good question. Thank you, Yasmin. And this is something I figured as I was, and predominantly my interviewees were women, but also like a lot of men. And what I found out in the course of my interactions with people from like marginalized, gendered, and sexualities was also their very expansive imagination of what it means to self-determine your own future, right? Or what does it mean to call for azadi, which it's a loose translation would mean freedom, right? And in those conversations, what stood out was a very self-aware critique of the social regulations and social inequalities that existed, both because and both outside of the conditions of occupation. So I think what the articulations that I heard and the articulations that I also uphold were taking a very cohesive and expansive understanding of what does it mean to be a politically self-determined subject, and what role does gender play in that. And with gender, it would also be to think about the kind of violences that persist and the kind of freezing of gender roles that happens, because there is a perpetual presence of an occupying of power or of security personnel, right, who continually surveil and who continually sort of harass you in different ways. So to respond to that question, in many ways, gender both complicates our understanding, and this I wanted to reflect in how I also accounted for Sidra's experience, because it was different kinds of patriarchies coming together and sharing or doing, inflicting certain kinds of ostracizations, right? So gender helps us really think through what's going on at a deep, ordinary, everyday level, but also feminist research in general then also orients us towards the project of social justice. That it's not just that we want gender equal relations, but it is a bigger project of how do we live in just ways, or what is it to embody and inhabit a just society. And I think those understandings that feminist theory has helped me get to are quite crucial to how conflict transformation may take place both at the level of really ordinary ways in which we interact or what happens in everyday lives, but also at the level of how everyday is always made in concert with global, national, political processes, right? So I think that is, I wouldn't say call it opportunity, but that could be an entry point to really think about how do we come out of a conflict in transformatory ways.
The interest of pegging this human experience to a broader canvas, what would be similar cases where similar frames would work? The question is on the messages, if you want to reread it.
And I think for that question, Swarna, if I understand it correctly, similar cases, and already a lot of emerging scholars have been doing it for the past decade, but I think there has been a lot of historical solidarity between the Kashmiri and the Palestinian struggle. And now we're seeing very similar, and if you go at the level of like state politics, we also see the very evident relations between India and Israel in relation to their arms trade, in relation to their military exchanges, knowledge exchanges. So I think, and therefore there's a similar tactic of violence also in operation across these two contexts of Kashmir and Palestine. So I think that would be very, and for my own work, reading through and engaging with a lot of Palestinian scholarship by Palestinian scholars was quite crucial to really understand what happens under occupation, what happens when you're surviving through conditions of apartheid, especially in relation to how it affects the deep or sort of the very mundanities of everyday life, things that often are taken for granted or not really given an analytical value. So that would be a very interesting sort of comparison in relation to how occupation works, even though the two contexts are very historically, I mean, they have their own historical circumstances. But also what I've seen recently is coming up of coalitions within India who are highlighting how security personnel, so these are not just like military forces, but also paramilitary forces like the CRPF, who are actually meting out the same kind of violence and surveillance also in Adivasi regions, right? So we're also seeing that kind of connection being drawn at the level of civil society, who's making the case of connecting what's going on in Kashmir in relation to what's going on in some of the indigenous, against indigenous people within India. And then we have, especially in relation to the frames of gender and racialization I'm looking at, and this is something that Hafsa Kanchwal's book, who I recommended, has really noted very crucially, is how in the Indian imagination, tourism in Kashmir and Kashmir as this beautiful, feminized, touristic marvel is shown is very similar to how the representations also operated in the context of Hawaii. So we're seeing very similar kind of I think statist processes and statist functions through which a dissident people are also occupied and controlled. So these are some of the comparative cases that speak to each other or speak to the context of Kashmir as well.
Maybe I'll jump into another question, Dr. Niharika. What's the way out right now? We've been talking because, as you said, you give like comparative studies about like, the problem in Palestine and other issues in the world. You have also other issues like the Western Sahara conflict that's been lasting for more than a half century. Still, there is no way out. In the case of Kashmir and India, what is the way out for you? I would like you, if this is possible, to talk as an academic, but also as from like a personal experience, somebody that comes from this area, from your heart. What's really the way out?
So I just need to clarify here. I'm from India. I'm not from Kashmir. So which is why I oriented, even the first question that was asked, what could be the possible solution? I oriented towards Kashmiri scholars or Kashmiri activists or human rights workers who and defenders who actually placed very well what could be the potential ways in which we're really inclined towards a conflict resolution in a way that's actually centering people. But at the level of but at the academic level, I think and I'm based in London, and what we are seeing here is, of course, a lot of heartbreak at what's going on in Gaza, but at the same time, a resurgence of a very different kind of global third world solidarity, both at the level of international politics. We have South Africa, but at the level of everyday politics, wherein we have close to like 400,000 people marching every Saturday across London. So I think that resurge of global solidarity is not just going out on the streets, but what that has led to is a deep engagement and a deep study of critical politics and political engagement. So what that's like how that's shaping up is we are, of course, able to have these conversations within classrooms as we were having already, but within our neighborhoods, right? In community spaces, Saturdays, Sundays, people are and people from all walks of life, right? People with kids, little kids, everyone who's coming together to really think and read about what's going on. And that kind of political education, I think, and I know this is a very slow process, right? But at that kind of level of political education, mobilization, and understanding of what it is to embody a just world. And I think that's infusing, I won't call it some kind of hope, but that's infusing some kind of determination towards keeping, that we need to keep struggling. And I think that kind of resurge of life in a way has been and is quite central to, think through all of these struggles, right? So first of all, especially when I look as an Indian, when I go back to India, or when I grew up in India, there's also so much misinformation or the complete lack of information about Kashmir, right? And clubbed with that now is a refusal to listen to people who are in Kashmir or what they are going through. So I think there are different levels to which we can really respond to this in a way that how is it that we educate collectively, but also encourage our own political education or education across community. And I think as an educator who's interested in seeing that kind of shift, that idea of collective study, collective reading, collective struggle is quite central to how I imagine my practice as both an academic as well as an educator.
Thank you again so much for this insightful, valuable presentation of yours, and thank you for to the participants. So I really would like to express my appreciation to you, Dr. Niharika, and to your valuable contribution to our RC07 webinar series. And my deepest gratitude also goes to all who attended the webinar, as well as to our committee members, Dr. Swarna, the head of our committee, as well as Maria Lucero, Daniela Perota, and Amanda Goes, who tirelessly, helped to make such a, a successful event, without forgetting our wonderful host for this. So thank you, and we really look forward to, to our next webinar, which is going to take place next month. So I really, again, encourage you to submit your pitches and to have such a great discussion as today.